Hi, good afternoon or good morning, everybody. My name is Danny Harris. I'm honored to be the Executive Director of Transportation Alternatives, and just so happy that you all could join us for a conversation on hopefully everybody's favorite or maybe the second favorite topic of bike parking. I just wanted to kind of lead off before I make an introduction here, just to talk a bit about, at least from our perspective, why we think that this is a critically important subject for discussion and why we thought it was so important to bring a panel of experts together to talk about it and to invite you to be part of that as well. I think as all of us know who ride a bike or understand cities that, it's obviously not enough just to simply build the type of infrastructure that allows people to move around by bike, but ensuring that they have a safe place to put it is obviously critical. I would encourage you to take a look at the report that we put out, but at least according to surveys in New York, outside of safety, secure bike parking was the second most cited reason for individuals not biking. We've seen that about a quarter of New Yorkers have had their bike stolen, and that bike theft has also been up significantly, about 27% since our bike boom of last year. So we see these as issues that are critical for our cities. There's also a critically important equity issue to this. We know that low-income and communities of color are more likely to ride a bike when they know that parking is available than whiter and higher income communities. So all of this is going to be part of our report, which we're excited for you to dig into. But without further ado, let me introduce our incredible panel. Shabazz Stewart is a local founder and CEO of Unipod, which provides affordable, secure bike parking for New Yorkers. Very warm welcome to you. Sarah Goforth works with the Portland Bureau of Transportation as their bike parking project manager. Sarah, welcome. Michael King is the founder of Traffic Calmer and works with progressive cities, campuses, and NGOs to invert the dominant auto-centric paradigm and advance a green mobility ethos. And Lou Feinberg is a national advocacy accounts manager for Darrow Bike Racks. And Lou and Darrow, I just want to thank you for your generous support of our report in this panel. So just a very warm thank you to you. So if I can, with maybe just sort of a simple question, is I'm curious from each of your perspectives, why you see bike parking as being critical for either transformation on our streets or cities. So Sarah, can we start with you and then we'll go to Lou, Shabazz, and Michael, please.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much for having me. So yeah, why is bike parking transformational? I mean, I think it really is a testament to how we can move people in our city infrastructure that takes up the least amount of space and has the lowest impact. And so we know that walking is the most efficient way, and next to that is obviously biking. And being able to park bikes in ways that stay out of the main pedestrian thoroughfares is a fantastic way to get people through the city. It also reduces congestion and it gives people greater access, not to mention, as a year-round cyclist myself, I just love being on my bike.
Well, we can build all the bike lanes we want, pathways, cycle tracks. If we don't have bike parking to go with it, it won't really do us any good. I mean, they really go hand in hand. That's why I think it's of utmost importance.
I think that's a great point. I think if we are serious about bicycles being a credible mode of transportation, then we have to make using a bike as convenient as using a vehicle like a car or in riding public transportation. And for that to work, we have to focus beyond just safety. We have to recognize that safety is necessary but not sufficient. And so we have to think about all the ecosystem elements that go along with using a form of transit. And parking is a core part of that. So people need to be able to park conveniently and securely. If you park at a rack, for example, but your bike won't be there in 4 hours, or it may be there, but it may be missing a wheel or a seat, it's going to be a non-starter for you. If we have a parking option, but it's up 2 or 3 flights of stairs, you're going to use your bike, but you're going to use it less because it's less convenient. So in order for bikes to be mainstream, we have to solve the parking challenge.
Michael, if you're talking, we can't hear you. We can't hear you, Michael. I think we may have lost you. So maybe we'll we'll come back and going. Yeah, conversations in the Zoom age. Sarah, maybe can you get us started? I mean, when we were looking at our analysis, we were really just sort of blown away by the incredible work that Portland especially has done on providing bike parking. Can you maybe give us a little bit more of the backstory here? Maybe any of the, sort of some of the history, or I guess some of the primary ways that you've seen the program to be successful and also scale?
Yeah, definitely. So I've been managing Portland's bike rack program, short-term bike parking, that is, for the last 3 years. And so long legacy that came before me to make this happen. So I actually reached out to one of my colleagues, Barb Plummer, who is still with my agency, and asked her, how did this all get started? And she told me that around 1990, it was a one-off opportunity with a bike shop who had about 50 racks, and they wanted to get them out to businesses. And so they kind of just went around and talked to businesses and said, hey, do you want these free racks? We'll put them on the sidewalk, we'll maintain them. And it was interesting. There's a lot of businesses that wanted them, and a bunch of them that were like, why would we want that? Fast forward now 30 years later, and we have over 4,000 bike racks that the city maintains. That's not at all including bike racks that are privately installed or on a property line of a new development. These are just our city ones. So it's well beyond that. And not only did that kind of ragtag beginning develop into something, but now we have a budget so that we can provide 2 free bicycle racks per business. And then after that, people can pay to have more installed. And I've definitely had businesses right out the gate being like, yeah, we want to have a whole bunch, because we already know that the demand is going to be really high. And in addition to the sidewalk racks, we definitely also use some on-street parking and utilize it for what's called a bike corral, where we actually put the racks in the street. And in our downtown corridor, of course, pre-COVID, this is an excellent use of space, and it also increases people's access to the businesses and gives businesses more business, because you get people with high turnover, more customers coming to your spaces. So that's kind of the humble beginnings of how Portland got its bike parking.
Can I just ask with this survey, how many of you have actually had a bike stolen? Okay.
3.
3, all right. So you've got, Michael, welcome back. You want to try your audio and see if you're...
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Welcome back.
Oh, I just went in, went out. I had a bike stolen.
Oh, okay.
I heard the survey.
Yeah, so I guess I'm curious from your perspectives, Shabazz, you mentioned this a bit, but I actually wanted to maybe start with you, especially given the work that you're doing with me. But can you also talk about kind of the significance of bike theft, sort of what it means at the aggregate, but also at an individual level?
Look, it's very simple. It's the greatest, most ignored transportation issue in the country. Here in New York, thanks to your great work, we know that 1 out of every 4 households have experienced bike theft. Can you imagine if that were a stat that were ported over to cars? It would be the front page of every newspaper in the country. Like 1 out of every 4 households has lost a car. On an individual level, here in New York, we have 50,000 working cyclists who power the restaurant industry. And those of you who are New Yorkers know that if you order from Seamless, Grubhub, Postmates, DoorDash, any of these delivery services, it's likely arriving on a bicycle. And when you talk to those folks who are usually Black, brown, or Asian, they'll tell you that they've had 1, 2, 3, 4. We have folks who have 7 bicycles stolen. And each time that happens, it's not just an annoyance or inconvenience. You're talking about 2 or 3 or 4 weeks worth of lost wages, because that e-bike is about $3,000 or $4,000. So it can be really devastating. And what we've seen in New York is a real lack of appreciation for how important and integral this issue actually is. And something that's surprising, when you look over to Europe, it's not just Amsterdam and it's not just Netherlands. You look at London, they have 150,000 on-street parking spaces, 7,500 of which are secure. New York only has 56,000 on-street parking spaces, 20 of which are secure. Those are provided by Uni. So we have a very, very long way to go, even to get to the standard set by another peer city. And the advocates in London say they need 3 times as many to even meet demand. So it's something that is pervasive, widely ignored, and underappreciated, and is, I think, indicative of how we still treat cycling like an amenity form of transportation, not a true utility form of transportation where people actually use it to get around.
Yeah, thanks. Lou, can you give us a kind of a bit of a, can you just talk to us a little bit more about some of the different types of bike racks and bike parking? Maybe help us to understand a bit more about what is available and what's being used effectively.
Yeah, since our conversation is mainly street bike parking today, I'll focus on that because it's actually a pretty broad topic. In terms of street bike parking, prior to working with Daryl, I actually was a founder at Bike Pittsburgh, and how we launched the organization, really, one of our first projects was a public art bike rack. It's called the Three Rivers Bike Rack, and that rack captured the city's imagination. And so I'll start there because I think that's so important. When we can have fun with bike racks and not just think of them as obviously their utility, but if we can inspire people and give them a great deal of imagination and to get bike racks in cities, sometimes that's all you need. I can't tell you how effective that public art bike rack was in getting more funding for bike racks, opening people's eyes to the prospect of bike racks. And subsequently, we've had both municipalities and companies try to mimic that bike rack and do their own sort of custom rack. And so it really took off in ways that you didn't expect. And it actually got Bike Pittsburgh into the bike rack business because that's one of the things Bike Pittsburgh does now. In addition to that, of course, we talked, or maybe that was prior to starting the webinar, with bike corrals, another huge opportunity for creating not just bike parking, but changing the conversation about space, about neighborhoods, and what the feel is to a neighborhood. So bike corrals are such a big part of that conversation. And another thing I'd like to mention is bike shelters on city streets or transit centers are growing in increasing importance because people are less and less willing to just lock their bike up outside, especially when they're going to be somewhere for hours. When we talk about bike parking, we talk about it frequently in short-term and long-term usage. Anything less than 2 hours is considered a short-term use, or some people still call that a class 2 use. But that's not necessarily as common. But the truth is a lot of people need to park their bike and they only have an option on city streets, especially a city like New York where building owners aren't putting bike parking inside. Having that sheltered parking outside on the streets is going to encourage more and more people to ride. When they know it's going to be sheltered and secure, it becomes more and more of an issue. So I'd say when we're thinking about bike parking on streets, capturing people's imagination, I think that custom rack's really important. I think bike corrals are vital to increasing and taking back space and changing the conversation a little bit. And opening visibility in streets. Bike corrals do tremendous in opening visibility and attracting and softening the tone of that street. And lastly, bike shelters in transit nodes and on city streets, vitally important. And that's still very much in its infancy. I really hope that we see that more and more of that grow.
Yeah. Michael, can I turn to you for a second? Obviously the work that you're doing is really trying to kind of reorient the center of our cities. Can you give us a little bit from your perspective about just some of the basics as it relates to, whether it's in New York or other cities that you're familiar with, just some of the sort of the requirements, especially around building for cars and car parking, as opposed to what might exist for bike parking and some of those discrepancies? You're on mute.
But this time when I press mute, you can hear me. And I have to say it's hard to ride a stolen bike, which is what I told people I was going to say on this webinar. You can think about that sentence. So the discrepancies or sort of, let's ask the question, what can we learn about from car parking that can influence bike parking? And so, because the way the cities have been rebuilt in the last basically 100 years is to provide car parking. And that's happened in sort of 3 ways. One is on street. The second way is off street in lots. And the third way is through zoning requirements. So for example, like in 1923, so 98 years ago, the National Conference of City Planning began to recommend off-street lots for car parking. And then so subsequently, or 1922, LA, Pittsburgh was 27, Chicago was 1930. They started building lots. And then just as a little bit of history, just as a way to sort of think about this. And then they started to, I think in 1923, Columbus, Ohio started requiring car parking for multifamily housing. Detroit in 1940 for theaters. And today, Houston, which famously has no zoning at all, does have car parking requirements for any developments. So I know that when was it, about 2010, what was the year that New York City passed legislation to require bike parking in sort of developments or in offices? 2009. Okay, yeah. And and that's something. It's not nothing. I'm curious about how it's going. I noticed that the garage across the street from my house charges $20 a day to park a bike, which seems high. But there it is. And so I guess the thing to say about that is that if New York City started in 2009 for zoning, and 1923 Columbus started with car zoning, that means we are about 70 years behind the car parking industry. Just as a way. So the question is that a model? And that model started, saw business groups get together and say we needed car parking for our businesses to work, and subsequently malls and things like that. And cities said we need zoning requirements so that people can have safe and secure places to store their bikes overnight and stuff like that. And so is that a model to follow? Have we been following that model for 11 years? Is that working? Is it not working? I don't know. But that's, it's sort of ingrained in the culture now.
I'd like to, Danny, if that's okay, I'd like to jump in and talk about zoning in New York City. Michael, I think that's a great point. Look, I think the city of New York took a step forward in 2009 with legislation called Bikes and Buildings. Transalt was a very key part of getting that passed and enacted. And it was a step in the right direction, but I think it's been largely ineffective for several reasons. Zoning is a way for the city to take a hands-off approach toward development. And there are two general models to how we can see any sort of infrastructure enacted. One is zoning, which is requiring the private sector through developing anything to build something that's included in the development. And the other is through a public offering, infrastructure that is operated in a citywide system, a la City Bike or Lincoln YC, et cetera, that is a public-private or purely public partnership. And so zoning was the former. And now we saw with zoning, new developments being required to put in bike rooms, workplaces being required to have bike action plans, and parking lots and parking garages being required to have bicycle parking allocated. In the case of new developments, most were compliant. Many actually filed DOB, Department of Buildings here in New York, action plans, and then actually don't include the bike parking. There's no provision for how convenient the bike parking must be. So we see lots of bike parking in buildings actually be in the basement, roof, et cetera. And so it's actually not convenient or applicable to the people who live there. As Michael mentioned, garages never bought into bike parking. So with only a few exceptions, Edison being the one exception here in New York, garage owners have decided that it's not in their interest to have their attendants parking bicycles. So they, jack up the rates to $20 a day, $400 a month, et cetera, as a deterrent to people actually using the service. And so the net result is that when you look at communities of color, especially working class communities, bike parking is largely rare. When you look at the neighborhoods in New York, think Park Slope, where most of the housing stock is relatively old. We're talking not new development. Bike parking is rare. When you're looking at places where, even in workplaces and commercial areas where you don't have progressive employers that, like Transalt, that provide bike rooms that lack bike action plans, bike parking is rare. And you have, the only remedy is for a employee to actually report their employer or their landlord to the DOT and hope that the DOT can follow up on the complaint. So the impact of zoning has been largely muted. So what we're pushing for here with UNI is a citywide bike parking systems to supplement in-building zone bike parking. We need 100,000 plus secure bike parking spaces across the city, especially at transit hubs, especially at commercial destinations, but also curbside and residential neighborhoods as well, with the realization that people aren't really able to haul their bikes up 4 flights of stairs to use them every day. That's a part of the conversation that we're just now starting to get cities to pivot to and realize that a public or public-private operated system, that supplemental is really the way to go.
Yeah. Lou and Sarah, I'd love for you to jump in on this from either obviously your perspective, Portland, or obviously Lou, what you've been seeing in other cities in terms of getting to more of that transformation.
Yeah, I mean, I think like Shabazz, you bring up so many really good points, and I think, and it's kind of a testament, kind of the historical context that Michael was giving us, is we've just had a transformation in how people get around. I mean, in Portland, we didn't even have bike share until 5 years ago, and then we got scooters. And so that's just a really short amount of time where all of a sudden we're seeing more and more ways people are getting around. And so we're thinking and rethinking this auto-centric planning. And so because of that, we're wondering, where do you park your own bicycle? Can you then encourage people to want to bike more when their older apartment buildings aren't retrofitted to be able to have this? And so I think we're in a really big conundrum. I also recognize too, the times that I've traveled to San Francisco, for example, if you're not locking both your wheels and your seat to the frame of the bicycle, those things will be gone. New York, I'm sure, is very similar. Thankfully, Portland's not quite there yet. So I don't think that there's like a one size fits all in terms of needs for different cities in terms of the level of absolute security. Of course, parking in a secure way is super important. But I think that there's like ways where, recognizing what is the city landscape like and sort of what's the trend will then encourage the appropriate type of bike parking facility. I know that in Portland, we do have a bike locker program. I used to manage it. And there are these one-to-one boxes that people have a key to, and they're old assets, but people really like the security of those, and I totally agree. Because the assets are sort of falling apart, we're looking now more at these bike rooms. But again, it's not a one-to-one, it's multi-use, and while you do have an access card to get inside of these, it opens you up to vulnerability. So I think it's like an important thing for planners and developers and city folks and everybody to kind of think strategically, what could this look like in the next 5 to 10 years? Because we need to catch up to this latent need, this latent demand, and really see like, what are people's transportation behaviors gonna be?
It's also not just bike theft. And that's an important point that we don't want to forget. Here in New York, you have a blizzard and you'll see bikes buried under the snow. You might have a tropical rainstorm and you'll see the rusted out hulks of bikes that are sitting there. So if people lack a convenient means to bring their bike in a protected space, it really can be quite detrimental to the overall experience, and it can increase maintenance costs or make using the bicycle basically impossible.
Sort of lending to what Sarah said, there's not a one size fits all solution. I'm really astounded at the different, I would say the different obstacles that cities face in terms of getting bike parking on the streets. And it's really all over the place. And sometimes it's so ridiculously cumbersome, requiring signatures from every utility that does or does not exist on a city street. So it's really all over the place. But I would say, passing those ordinances and getting people on board, you never know when that critical moment's going to be where things start to shift. But the key is keep getting that infrastructure on the street, because that infrastructure is not only important for the bicyclists, but it sends a powerful message to the people in the city. And every time they see a bike rack, every time they see someone bicycling, that's 80% of the people that could be riding a bike, and somewhere or another, that's reminding them that's more and more of a possibility. And so when that thing kicks over, the enforcement of it isn't so important. It doesn't isn't as much of a priority with ordinances, for example, because the developers just want to do it. They realize the demand is there and it kicks in. And that's the kind of positive momentum that we want to see.
Right. I know we have a number of people on the call who are also coming from the advocacy community, like TA, and maybe Mike, I'd want to start with you. I think many of us, sort of we're very vocal about advocating for bike infrastructure, but maybe not always thinking about how to pair it most effectively. So I'm curious if maybe you want to start, and anybody else has advice about, especially those who are advocating for change in their neighborhoods, if there are better ways of starting to pair those ideas earlier on.
Sure. I think that the obvious parallel for me is streeteries. And you don't know what that is. It's the sidewalk cafes that are in the street. And they're now called streeteries, and for better or worse. And what I find interesting about the sidewalk cafes in the street is that the restaurateurs have taken it upon themselves to really sort of push for this now that they've discovered the possibilities. And I've been in this business for long enough to know that it was very lonely for a long time as an advocate or as someone, a professional, trying to sort of convince people to do these things. And then suddenly this pandemic has got all the restaurants on board because they see this value, and maybe it's pandemic specific. But the point is that there's this convergence. Like somebody else is interested in what you're doing, which is it's nice, It's like, wow, somebody else is interested in this subject too. Who knew? And so where are those? Where's that convergence in bike parking? The hammer of zoning is, maybe it's not going to work. Maybe it is going to work. I don't know. I mean, Shabazz says it's not really working yet so far. But where's that convergence of you see in the ads in the newspapers, and the fancy people with wearing old bikes, and they're in the advertisement, and they're selling products, and they're like some old bicycle. And it's like, okay, so are you the people who are going to help us put in bike parking too? Or are you just selling clothes? So I don't know. So where's the apartment people? I mean, we renovated our house and we put in a big bike room because we did. And because whatever, I have 7 bikes or 8, or I don't know how many I have. And so where is the developer who's like, hey, let's build a whole bunch of apartments with bike rooms in someone's house, not in the basement somewhere. So I don't know. So that's the convergence. And I don't know the answer to this question. I mean, there's clues.
Well, Michael, I just to clarify, I don't think that zoning is ineffective. I think zoning can be effective. I'll offer an example. We're working with a developer on 737 4th in Brooklyn that is going through the New York City ULURP process, which means you're seeking a zoning exception. And as part of that process, they're offering to build a public bike room, a bike station, essentially. It's going to have a capacity of 180. And so if we treat in zoning bike stations like car garages, where there has to be an operator, it has to be open to the public, essentially, then I think that's a solution that can scale very well. But right now, what we basically do in New York is we say, well, developer building a new building, you just offer your tenants a bike room. And we see that perpetuates inequality in terms of the mode. We see that it's, here in New York, we've had tens of thousands of new housing units added year over year, not nearly enough to affect the vast majority of New Yorkers. So what we need is publicly available facilities and new developments. But I also think, just to answer Danny's question about the kinds of conversations that we want to have in our communities, we need to reset expectations. I think people are still regarding using a bike as a novelty and an amenity, when we need to start thinking about using a bike as a critical mode of transportation that's on par with using a car or using public transit. And so I would ask people in New York, for example, think about the fact that when we look at using a bus, we understand that people need to have a place to wait for the bus. They need to be sheltered. So we used advertising revenue to build 3,000 bus shelters in New York City. We thought that folks should have a place to buy newspapers and candy on the street. So we used advertising revenue to build 400 newsstands. We thought that Wi-Fi should be available for free to New Yorkers. So we partnered with a private company, an intersection, to build 1,700 Lincoln YCs. We thought that bike share should be available to everyone. So we built 800 plus city bike stations. If we are really serious about bicycle parking, we will take a systemic view and build bike parking facilities for the public that are protected and secure on scale. That's the key word: systemic, on scale, and available to the public.
You know, I think it's worth mentioning, and I don't know if this has really taken off or not. If it certainly hasn't taken off too much, but over time it may, just like LEED and green building initiatives had. But there's an initiative called Park Smart, and it's essentially about doing the same kind of standards for parking garages, and it includes a pretty heavy requirement for bike parking. Just something to keep in the toolbox, and encouraging and enticing operators to offer bike parking.
Something that comes to mind with this discussion is, yes, I totally agree that we need to like really invest in all this. And then the big question is, how do we allocate that sort of funding, and how do we rewrite how we can spend money? And I think that's the biggest challenge. Is it looks good on paper, but really, how are we going to pay for this? Especially now during COVID. I mean, I work for a city, and we're losing revenue like nobody's business. So I think it's a big challenge.
Yeah, I'm curious for your perspectives too. With e-bikes were just legalized in New York, and if we look at other markets, especially in Northern Europe, where I think we looked at them for many things in our space, but one of them at least seems to be that the sale of e-bikes will soon surpass the sale of regular bikes. So I'm curious from your perspectives of how you think about bike parking, also as it relates to the potential for either charging stations, or also for the fact that people might be riding more expensive bikes, and that also sort of adds another sense of urgency into the space. So maybe Louis, Sarah, I'm curious from the infrastructure, even from the product side, if and how you might be starting to think about that, and obviously welcome anybody's perspective here.
Yeah, I mean, something that we did with our, it's a small start, but Portland got a bike parking room, is we made sure that there was a minimum amount of spaces for cargo and larger bicycles, also for people who have trailers or have kids, and realizing there's really not, again, there's not one size fits all. And we've seen this surge in e-bikes and cargo bikes in the past couple of years. And so again, we need to, as jurisdictions, really be forward thinking and not just plan for this really narrow idea of what it means to have bike parking, because there's families in a certain neighborhood where they have kids that they need to take with them. And if they don't have a way to carry the trailer and the space for it and it's covered, it doesn't work. And so I think we need to be really mindful that there's not a one size fits all type of scenario where you just have your little road bike. That's not realistic if we're really trying to have bicycles be a primary form of transportation for folks to get their essential needs taken care of.
Yeah, Danny, you're absolutely right. E-bikes are just going eventually to surpass regular bikes, it seems. And I think as commuters and people that commute by bicycle, especially in a city where I'm from, Pittsburgh, e-bikes are an amazing alternative. It helps get people up the hills here. So charging stations are going to be, I think they're going to be a big part of the future. And what does that look like, and how they integrate with mobility hubs? That's going to be a big part of the equation as well. How that all happens. And so people are going to be, I would think, willing to pay for those services, and so it'll be partly market driven. If you want to get somewhere with your e-bike, because like you say, it's going to be a secure option. You're going to want a secure option because you're riding a $2,000 to $3,000 or more bike. You got to be able to charge it, and you want it to be secure. So, we could see the market open up for some of these things. It's not ideal because it's going to take a little more time, but to get public dollars right now is going to be really challenging.
Well, I just want to jump in, as a market operator who operates bike shelters in New York City that have charging stations in them, the challenge, the market is there. There are market operators like my company that are doing that right now. The challenge is that, and we're leveraging private capital to do it. We're free to use for the public, and we're free to use for the city. We don't use one dime of taxpayer money. The challenge is here in New York, getting cities to open up alternate streams of financing to bike infrastructure. So look, I'll be very direct. If we're going to use advertising and sponsorship dollars to pay for bike share, so in Portland we have Bike Town USA from Nike, right? In New York, we've got advertising and everything from bus shelters to Wi-Fi. Then let's treat bicycle transportation in that same class category. And that's how we can leverage capital to pay for this infrastructure. We cannot have the market be asked to provide these solutions for free and then say, oh, by the way, the city has no money. Now go out and build 3,000 or 4,000 of these stations. So it's really, really essential that cities start to really evaluate what their streetscape franchises look like when they think bike bus shelters and newsstands and on-street furniture, and start to incorporate bike parking and secure bike amenities and charging into that class.
And I would even go a step further with that, Shabazz, is a really great points, is with bike share systems. Portland this year, we actually just went to a completely electric fleet. Bike Town is now all e-bikes, and we're expanding the fleet here in the next 1 to 2 years. But notice how these bike share companies rely on sponsorship. But you look at your municipal transit and they get federal dollars. So can we change code in DC to say, yes, federal transportation dollars can be spent on bike share, scooter share, so that the end cost ends up being a lot more affordable. I will say that I'm very happy that Bike Town does have a equity program so that people living on low incomes can absolutely access the bikes. It's not a burden in a way that it would be if you were paying regular price. But again, that's not enough if we really want to, push this form of transportation.
So we have a number of questions. So let me turn to them. If you have a question, then please feel free to include it in the chat. But let me just start with Teddy. Who also listed here that it seems like him and somebody else have had their bike stolen. So it seems like a good place to start. So sorry to hear that, Teddy. I guess you're part of a special club. But you ask, what advice do you have for people looking to build outdoor bike storage on your street? In his case, he talked about trying to reach out to DOT, but heard nothing back. So, he's really inspired by the cycle hoop blockers in London, and just curious from sort of an individual perspective, if you have perspectives of how people can be pushing for some of the type of things that we've talked about today.
What city is he writing from? It would be DOT.
So he's writing, I think he's writing from New York. Yeah. But I guess maybe from Shabazz, maybe you want to talk about from New York, but obviously if anyone else has a vision from whether it's Pittsburgh or Portland or Michael, New York, or any other city that you've worked with.
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak first on New York. Look, we want to build bike hangars in New York. We want to build and operate them on the curb. I mean, the challenge is not can we do it? We're not splitting the atom here. we're not solving, not curing cancer. The challenge is regulatory. I make that very clear. In New York, the challenge is regulatory. Whenever you put anything on the street, as Sarah knows, you need to have authorization from the city to do so and to operate it. You cannot just put something on the public right of way. And so, especially if it's going to be paid for with sponsorship or advertising, then cities are very strict in how that works. And so if we were looking to figure out how to move the city to power, then let your city council member know that bike parking and coverage and protected bike parking, like the cycle hoop hangars in London, are an essential part of streetscape furniture. The city of New York and other cities have to recognize that if we're going to have 4.5 here in New York, 4.5 million on-street car parking spaces, then why can't we be like London and have 1,600 bicycle hangars on the street, right? It's really a small fraction. So it's a conversation that has to take place in the public sector about what is appropriate to have on the street, how we allocate public right of way.
And I think looking at other cities that do have this is going to be the selling point. We did have an apartment complex in Portland reach out to us saying, hey, for exactly that, having a bike shelter in the right of way for tenants because their apartments were built at a time that they can't be retrofit to have secure bike parking. And so what this does all of a sudden is it opens up all this, well, who's going to manage it? Who's going to pay for it? Who has access? What about vandalism? How do you clean the street if it doesn't allow for, there's all these things. So instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, go look at cities that have done it and then come with that modest proposal and say it's a pilot and say, let's try it for a year and then re-examine it. And a lot of times that's when things stick. Not always, but hopeful.
This is a question that came in from Ben. Ben says that locking bikes to racks is a huge pain in the neck and a deterrent against quick use for errands. They're also not particularly secure as components can be stolen. By contrast, City Bike is seamless and secure. Is the bike industry working to provide these types of solutions in terms of, I guess, thinking about maybe a locking mechanism that's connected to a bike?
That's a Darryl question.
Yeah, it's funny that early on when the bike parking class standards, like in the 70s, came about, this was actually a class of bike rack, and it's really fallen out of vogue having a bike rack that actually locks and has a locking mechanism. There are products in the market now. I think one is called Bike Keep that actually has that mechanism. They're expensive though, and they're cost prohibitive as they are right now. Not to say they won't work or that there's not a future for them, but as of now, they just, people are usually offering bike rooms for secure bike parking or your standard bike racks in the street. There's a huge upstart cost for those.
I think
sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Shabazz.
No, I was going to add, we're looking at $25,000 per rack for some of the premium products. So just add a number to that expense.
One of the things that this brings up for me, the question about, I use my bike all the time to run errands, and I lock it up to stuff, and it doesn't bother me. It's part of the deal. And I still have the bike. But it brings up this question of what are we, the problem I have with this question of bike parking is that bike parking for whom and for how long and where. And, I feel that, I have a crappy bike that I ride and I lock up when I run errands and whatever. And nothing on the bike can get stolen because it's all screwed on. And I never, and so, and if it gets stolen, whatever, as the bike snob in that book said, your bike is already stolen, just get over it. And so for me, that's kind of, okay, I'll lock it up to a pole or to a bike rack or to, 3 bikes together. So if you steal it, you have to lift 3 bikes kind of stuff. But so there's this and this is getting to the question about, but there's this thing about where do you put an e-bike if you're a delivery guy at night so it doesn't get stolen? Who's stealing e-bikes and where are they being stolen from? And I don't know the answer to that question, but if you see if that's like a real issue, then how do we solve, where do we put e-bikes at night? Is that the question? And how do we do that? So it's this, I think that there's a lot of different layers of bike parking that we can solve with one thing or the other thing. And that's what sort of has me thinking about listening to this conversation.
I'm not doing my due diligence if I don't give my pitch for some things that bicycle owners can do to help prevent bike theft. Again, there's no magic wand, but investing in a good U-lock, higher quality than standard, I cannot recommend it enough. I used to manage our abandoned bike program, and it would be, frames that were basically stripped and then left on the pole. So I've cut lots of bike locks. I've cut lots with angle grinder and with bolt cutters, and I know which ones are good and which ones aren't. So get online and invest in that extra if you can, because in the long run it will help. Again, it's not perfect. The second thing I will say is very few people actually register their bikes on national bike registries. And I have successfully returned bicycles that have been abandoned in the right of way to their owners because I found a listing. So Project 529, that's the numbers 529, Project 529 and Bike Index are really well-known ones. And it takes 5 to 10 minutes and you document your bike. And so if and when it gets stolen, you can send an alert out. Again, there's no magic wand, it'll come back, but it's another layer of prevention. And then I will go another step further and say that I feel like more cities need to do more outreach with bike shops and don't allow them to sell cable locks, period. I think they should be outlawed. And I also think that people selling bikes at bike shops require people to register their bike at the time of purchase and also give them a little pitch about the proper way to lock a bike. You know, there's an unfortunate thing when people have never ridden a bike before and they lock the front wheel. Well, they have a front wheel left on the rack. So anyway, those are some additional things that can be done. Again, there's no perfect model and things will get stolen if they get stolen, but if you can take that additional step, it is helpful.
You know, I'd add to that, just making sure there's some social platform in the city where you report stolen bikes. The recovery rate, at least when I was at Bike Pittsburgh, was pretty remarkable. I mean, a bike would pop up on, I think it was Bike Pittsburgh's Facebook page, and within a couple of days, it was a very good chance that bike will be spotted and even returned back to the owner. So that's another way to address this.
You know, look, if we want people on bikes to account for 20% of mode share in a city like New York, we're talking about going from 510,000 trips a day to 2 or 3 million trips a day, if not more, right? And we need to, you know, we know how to solve this problem, which is by making secure bike parking as plentiful, as affordable as secure car parking, or as car parking in general. You have 4.5 million on-street public spaces for car parking that are free to use in New York City. So, you know, there's a lot of work being done to explain to people what they can do to mitigate the risk of theft by using locks, or what they can do to find their bike after it's been stolen. The problem is that that's not scalable. We're not going to get people who are thinking about buying a bike for the first time and using their own personal bike, of which that's 95% of bike trips in New York City, to invest in that mode share, to use a bike as their primary means of transportation, unless we can solve for this problem. And the only way we can solve this problem going forward is by providing the critical infrastructure that is necessary. Everything else, I'm afraid, is just something that's just not going to be, you're going to get people who are dedicated, who cycling is part of who they are, and they're going to be okay with the risk of theft, or they're going to be okay with riding a beater bike around town. But the average person who's riding a bike who wants to buy a $2,000 or $3,000 e-bike is not going to be okay with that risk. And you're going to do two things. They're going to either not ride their bike at all and leave it upstairs in their apartment, let's say they go to the park, or they're going to choose to not buy a bike in the first place.
Well, Shabazz, you've actually identified even another layer of information that I hadn't even considered before 2 o'clock when this call started, is that so you just said your target audience, or a target audience, might be someone who's buying a $2,500 e-bike. Okay. And you don't want to lose a $2,500 e-bike. And so now my question is, where do you keep these things so that they don't get stolen? And
right now, there's no answer.
Exactly, but see, that's my question. And so it's almost like our bike parking strategies are for the last, we're fighting the last war, not the next one. Because and Sarah, you just said that Portland, whatever it's called, has switched to e-bikes now. So if e-bikes are the future, and we're not talking about beater bikes and bike culture like people like me who have a 1960 Raleigh because it's cool and everything's chained together and whatever. So now we're talking about a different class of user, not class, but a different sort of class of bike. $2,500 is 10 times more than I paid for
Or
mine.
even if you have
Or
$1,000
20,
road
or
bike.
20 times. Yeah, right. But we're talking about a differential of 20 times what I paid for my bike. Okay. And so, and now you're talking about, is it even conceivable for someone to think about parking that bike on the street in an unprotected way? Or do we have to think about some sort of protected, secure, monitored kind of situation and then you're talking about a spatial allocation of where that is, because that can't be in front of every store. That has to be, and it can't be just in every parking garage. And, you know, so let's say you have it at your home and your office because of zoning, but then you can't use it anywhere else.
Mhm.
Because now we've introduced another.
Well, no, look, that's why we need a public secure bike parking system where we've got bike parking like bus shelters. I mean, that's the answer, in my opinion. Look, that's the work I do. That's my purpose right now professionally, but that's the answer, is where we build a network.
Right, and I understand that now that you've sort of now I start to see where you're coming up with that answer, because you're trying to solve the problem of someone who's riding more than a beater bike, an expensive bike, and they need to park it in 3 or 4 or 5 different places during the course of the day. And so how do we organize that spatially and operationally?
I think the word you just used is very key, operationalize. Like, we're trying to operationalize bikes as mode share. How does this work as a transportation strategy on scale? And having a bike parking network is a key part of that. Just like having a protected network of lanes that doesn't cut out here and there is a key part of that. So to me, it's just something that we've ported over from public transit, where you need to have an actual coherent network. That is a strategy that works in every other mode of transit. If we're serious about bikes as transit, we need to adopt that here as well.
Yeah, I think you poured it over from car parking.
Well, and I think too, what this lends itself to, and the reason why I'm gonna stick with this, like, give people the tools so they're not like, oh, whoops, my bike got stolen. The infrastructure doesn't exist yet. So are we saying don't ride your bike until we have a secure parking space? No, we're saying in the meantime, we're recognizing that this is a need. So maybe you ride bike share because that's an option for you. Maybe you wait until there is more of this infrastructure. Maybe you do have a bike, but you have a good lock. I think people need to know what all the options are available to them, and not wait for the city, not wait for something to get stolen because they didn't know, and not wait on accessing an e-bike when maybe their bike share system or just a shared bike system in general is available to them. I think people need to know that they have all of these options until we do build out something more robust.
Yeah, but Sarah, that's not how you sell cars, and that's not how you sell booze. I mean, you've never seen a car ad that says this car locks. You know, you've always seen a car route.
Each city is different. So like Portland, we don't have the same needs and concerns as New York City or San Francisco. And so I think it's recognizing how is each city unique and what are the needs. We do have zoning codes now that does have more bike parking. We do have a bike share system that we didn't have that long ago. Our public bike racks are now designed to have an extra bar, and they have a cable to the tubing so that if somebody tries to cut through the actual rack, they can't get the bike off. Again, these aren't perfect solutions, but they're iterative, but it's unique to Portland. Would that work somewhere else? Maybe, maybe not, you know?
I want to know where the convergence is. I want to know who else is doing stuff that we can tag on to.
Look, just FYI, European cities are doing this right now. When you look at Amsterdam and London, this is not hypothetical stuff. I mean, London has 7,500 dispersed secure bike parking spaces throughout the city. Amsterdam has bike parking garages that are as common as bodegas are in New York City. So there are models for this that work. We just have to look elsewhere, beyond our own borders, and we'll find some really compelling answers. But Sarah, I think your point is well taken. We're not telling people don't use your bike right now. People should take precautions, but we do want to articulate to government that there is a better way long-term in the infrastructure vision to really accommodate the future growth we're going to see in this marketplace.
Shabazz, what's the density you think systems like this would work? They clearly can't work everywhere. Do you have any sense of up to what kind of density you need for such a robust system to work?
I think bike share is a great example. Look, with bike share, we know the walk back zone is about 2 or 3 blocks before someone says this is inconvenient for me to use, right? That's why with City Bike, we have 800 plus stations for 3.5 boroughs. I think the answers are there in car parking and in public transit. We just have to port a vision like that over to cycling. And if the answer, Lou, the answer is going to be intimidating. It's going to be large. But if we're going to say, you know what, in Portland or New York or New Orleans, we want 25% of our trips to be on bikes, then that is what it's going to take to get there.
So that's an incredibly inspiring thing to start to close out on. So I just want to thank all of you for your incredible thought, insight, and obviously the spirited debate. It seems like we could certainly be having this conversation for a lot longer. And I do think that there's a really sort of interesting ending point about, the various stages of advocacy in terms of what we need to be doing, both in terms of, how we can best kind of communicate how people can sort of move with their bikes safely around a city, while obviously ensuring that people have the tools and resources to advocate for more. I think in the New York City context, I know a number of us have sort of commented on or seen it firsthand, but New York just built a big, shiny new train station that has no bike parking. And so, especially no secure bike parking. And I think if you look across, especially some of the big infrastructure projects that are playing out, even in our cities, the ones that are more dense or more sort of, leaning into the visions that we're talking about, I think a lot of it is, we're seeing this play out where there are huge opportunities that are immediately missed because it's not even considered how to incorporate some of this bike infrastructure, including bike parking, into critical transportation nodes. So I think that there are some things that maybe we would view as obvious, but I think even those who are focusing on intermodal transportation are not even considering. So we clearly have a lot of work to do, but again, just a huge thank you to all of you, most importantly for the work that you're doing on the front lines and your partnership. Lou and Darrow, again, just a huge thank you for helping to make this happen. So I encourage you to keep the conversation going. Please read the report. If you have questions for any of the panelists, then you can follow up with us and we'll make sure to direct them. And I know Reed and Doug and a few others, I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to get to your questions, but hopefully we can find a way to connect offline. So thank you all, and we look forward to continuing the conversation soon. Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much, Danny and TA.
Thank you. Have a good day.